Good evening. Welcome back to Whispered History. Tonight we are leaving behind the crowded roads, the cities, and the familiar lights of civilization. Instead, we are traveling west, far beyond the old frontier settlements, beyond the last lonely cabin, into a world of towering mountains, frozen rivers, deep forests, and enormous stretches of wilderness, where a man could disappear without leaving so much as a footprint behind. In the early 19th century, thousands of men dreamed of such a life. They were trappers, hunters, explorers, wanderers. They became known as mountain men. Some entered the Rocky Mountains searching for beaver pelts, which could be traded for money, weapons, clothing, and supplies. Others were drawn by something harder to explain: the freedom of the wilderness, the possibility of living beyond the reach of ordinary society. A man could leave St. Louis with a rifle across his shoulder, a horse beneath him, and a few possessions tied to a pack saddle. And months later, he might be hundreds of miles away, following a river whose name had never appeared on any map he had seen. But the mountains demanded a price. The cold could kill a man in a single night. A broken leg could become a death sentence. A sudden snowstorm could erase a trail within minutes. A grizzly bear could turn a routine hunting trip into a fight for survival. Food could disappear, horses could be stolen, rivers could become impossible to cross. And sometimes, a man simply vanished. No witnesses, no grave, no final message. No one knew where he had gone. Perhaps he died alone beneath the trees. Perhaps an avalanche buried him beneath tons of snow. Perhaps he became lost and wandered farther into the wilderness until he could no longer find his way home. And sometimes there was no evidence at all, only a name in an old journal, a missing horse, an abandoned camp. And a story passed quietly from one mountain man to another. Tonight we are going to explore those stories. But this is not simply a story about men who disappeared. It is a story about the world they entered, a world that was still enormous, wild, and largely beyond the control of the United States. A world where rivers were highways, mountains were landmarks, and a man's greatest protection was often his ability to read the land. So before we begin our journey into that forgotten wilderness, if you enjoy long, relaxing historical stories here on Whispered History, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and tell me where you are listening from. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Whispered History. Your support helps this channel continue bringing you peaceful journeys through forgotten chapters of history. Now, turn down the lights, get comfortable, let your surroundings become quiet, and allow yourself to imagine a time when the nearest town might have been hundreds of miles away, a time when the mountains seemed to stretch forever. Our story begins in the years when the American frontier was still moving westward. Around the beginning of the 19th century, the United States was changing rapidly. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 had suddenly placed an enormous territory under American control. On maps in eastern cities, the land appeared vast and almost empty, but it was not empty. Indigenous nations had lived across these regions for thousands of years. They knew the rivers, they knew the mountain passes, they knew where buffalo gathered and where winter storms could become deadly. They understood the land in ways that newly arrived explorers could scarcely imagine. For Americans living east of the Mississippi River, however, the western interior seemed mysterious. There were mountains on the horizon that few Americans had ever seen. There were rivers whose courses remained uncertain. There were valleys that had never been described in eastern newspapers. And somewhere among those mountains, there were beavers. That small animal would help create an entire frontier industry. Beaver fur was extraordinarily valuable because its dense underfur could be processed into felt. European and American hat makers prized it. For ambitious young men, the fur trade offered an opportunity to make money while experiencing a life far removed from ordinary society. One of the most important centers of this trade was St. Louis. By the 1820s, the city had become a gateway to the western interior. Imagine standing there on a cool morning. The Mississippi River moves slowly beneath a pale sky. Flatboats and keelboats crowd the waterfront. Merchants shout to one another, horses stamp their feet beside loaded wagons. Barrels of flour, ammunition, tobacco, blankets, tools, and other supplies are being prepared for journeys westward. Among the crowds are men preparing for the mountains. Some are experienced hunters, others are young and ambitious. Many have never spent a winter beyond the settled frontier. They may have heard stories from returning trappers, stories of rivers filled with beaver, stories of enormous mountains, stories of native peoples who could travel through country that seemed impossible to cross, and stories of men who had vanished. Yet the possibility of adventure is stronger than the fear. A young man might spend months preparing his equipment. He needs a good rifle, a knife, a powder horn, a blanket, warm clothing, cooking equipment, a horse or mule, and enough supplies to survive until he can hunt or trade. Nothing can be wasted. Every ounce carried into the mountains eventually has to be carried back out. Then one morning, he leaves. Perhaps a few friends accompany him. Perhaps he travels with a larger trading expedition. Behind him are the familiar roads and farms of the settled country. Ahead, the wilderness. At first, the journey may not seem particularly frightening. There are trails, other travelers, trading posts, rivers with established crossings. But every mile westward changes the character of the journey. Trees become thicker, prairies become wider, the horizon becomes larger. Eventually, the mountains appear. Imagine seeing the Rocky Mountains for the first time. After weeks or months of travel, their distant peaks rise above the horizon. Snow remains visible even beneath the summer sun. The mountains appear impossibly large. They are not simply hills waiting to be crossed. They are an entire world. And beyond them, there are more valleys, more rivers, more mountains. For a young trapper standing there for the first time, it must have been both beautiful and unsettling. He has reached the place he dreamed about. But he has also reached a place where mistakes can become fatal. The mountain men quickly learned that survival required more than courage. It required patience. A man had to know when to move and when to stay. He had to understand weather. He had to protect his horse. He had to conserve ammunition. He had to recognize edible plants. He had to know how to build a fire when everything around him was wet. And perhaps most importantly, he had to understand that the wilderness did not care how brave he was. A skilled hunter could still freeze. A strong rider could still fall. An experienced trapper could still become lost. The mountains offered no guarantees. For some men, that danger became part of the attraction. They wanted a life where every day mattered, where their decisions had immediate consequences, where the difference between survival and death might depend upon a single choice. And so they stayed. They learned the trails. They learned the rivers. They traded with indigenous communities. They hunted. They trapped. They fought. They made friendships. Some married and became part of indigenous communities. Some eventually returned east with stories that sounded almost impossible. Others remained in the mountains for years, and some never returned at all. That is where the mystery begins. Because when we look back through the surviving journals and accounts of the American frontier, we find fragments, a man mentioned in one trading record, a name appearing in an old journal. a trapper remembered by companions, a campsite discovered after a winter storm, a horse found wandering without its rider. Sometimes, decades later, people would still repeat the story. That was where he disappeared. Nobody ever found him. The mountains took him. But what really happened? Tonight, we will walk slowly into that question. We will separate the documented history from the legends. We will meet some of the real men who entered the Rocky Mountains and examine the dangers they faced. We will explore forgotten trails, abandoned camps, deadly winters, encounters with wildlife, conflicts, illness, and the simple problem that has claimed countless travelers throughout history: getting lost. Because in the 19th century American West, getting lost was not an inconvenience. It could mean that nobody would ever find you. So settle in. Let the sound of the wind carry you back nearly 2 centuries. The fire is burning low. Your horse is tied nearby. Beyond the small circle of light lies a forest so dark that you cannot see more than a few yards ahead. Above you, the mountains rise silently beneath a sky filled with stars. Somewhere out there, a river is moving through the darkness. Somewhere beyond that river, another valley waits. And somewhere in those mountains, there are stories of men who walked away from their camps and were never seen again. Tonight, we begin looking for them. The mountains had always been there, long before American trappers arrived, long before wagons crossed the plains, long before anyone drew lines across a map and called the land a territory. The Rocky Mountains belonged to a much older world. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples had traveled through these valleys and passes. They knew where the rivers narrowed. They knew where mountain storms arrived first. They knew which valleys offered shelter during winter. They knew where game could be found when the high country became cold. To a newcomer carrying a rifle and a handful of supplies, the mountains could seem endless. To the people who knew them, they were a landscape filled with familiar paths. This difference in knowledge would become one of the most important facts in the history of the mountain men. A trapper could be an excellent shot. He could ride for days. He could survive on very little food. But none of that guaranteed that he understood the country. A river that looked harmless in summer could become impossible to cross in spring. A mountain pass that seemed open beneath the afternoon sun could disappear beneath snow before nightfall. And a trail that was obvious in September might vanish completely by November. The men who entered the mountains therefore depended upon knowledge passed from one traveler to another. They listened, they watched, and they remembered. Imagine a small camp beside a mountain stream around the year 1820. 3 trappers sit beside a fire. Their horses graze nearby. A kettle hangs above the flames. One of the older men is explaining a route through the mountains. He points toward the darkness. Tomorrow, they will follow the river. Then they will turn west toward a narrow pass. After that, they must be careful. There is little water beyond the pass. The younger men listen closely. A single mistake could cost them days of travel. The fur trade was not simply about setting traps, it was about movement. Beavers lived beside streams and rivers. To find them, trappers had to travel constantly. They built temporary camps. They carried their equipment from valley to valley. They watched the seasons carefully. Spring and autumn could be productive. Summer offered easier travel. Winter was something else entirely. In the high mountains, winter could transform the landscape into a frozen maze. Snow covered familiar trails. Streams froze. Food became difficult to find. A man could wake one morning and discover that the world outside his shelter had completely changed. Imagine opening the flap of your shelter in January. The fire has nearly gone out. The air inside is painfully cold. Outside, snow covers everything. The trees are white. The mountains have disappeared behind clouds. Your horse stands buried almost to its chest in snow. There is no road, no nearby town, no rescue party waiting somewhere beyond the next ridge. You have only your companions, I mean your animals, your weapons, and whatever food remains. This was the reality of the mountain trade, and yet men continued going west. The reason was simple. The rewards could be enormous. Beaver pelts could be sold for good money. A successful season might allow a trapper to return to civilization with enough wealth to start a business, buy land, or simply live comfortably for a time. But money was not the only attraction. There was something about the wilderness itself. Many mountain men became deeply attached to the life. They learned to sleep beneath the stars. They became comfortable with silence. They knew how to move through forests without making much noise. They could read tracks in the mud and understand what had passed hours earlier. They could look at clouds and recognize approaching weather. The mountains changed them. Some men who entered the wilderness as young adventurers eventually became almost inseparable from it. They stopped thinking like people from the settled East. Their world became rivers, trails, horses, hunting grounds, and distant rendezvous. One of the most important gatherings in this world was the mountain rendezvous. Imagine arriving at one in the early 1820s. For months, trappers may have been scattered across the mountains, each small group working independently. Then, at an appointed time and place, they gathered. Hundreds of people could be present. Trappers arrived carrying bundles of beaver pelts. Merchants brought supplies from St. Louis. Blacksmiths repaired damaged equipment. Horses were traded, food was purchased, news was exchanged. For men who had spent months in isolation, the rendezvous could feel almost overwhelming. Music, drinking, trading, arguments, laughter, stories. A temporary frontier town appeared in the wilderness and then disappeared again. Imagine a trapper arriving after months alone. His beard is long, his clothing is worn, his hands are scarred from work. He unloads his pelts. A merchant counts them carefully. The trapper receives supplies in exchange: fresh coffee, flour, tobacco, a new blanket, a replacement rifle. For a short time, civilization has returned, but eventually, the celebration ends. The merchants pack their wagons, the trappers prepare their horses, the temporary town breaks apart. Men ride away in different directions, and once again, the wilderness becomes silent. This cycle repeated year after year. The mountain men developed their own culture within this world. They had nicknames, stories, superstitions, favorite hunting grounds, personal rivalries, and friendships that could last a lifetime. Some became famous, others remained almost completely unknown. That is important when we think about the men who disappeared. The historical record often remembers the famous mountain men because their names appeared in journals and newspapers, but hundreds of ordinary trappers left much weaker traces. A man could spend 10 years traveling through the mountains and leave behind only a few sentences in somebody else's journal. Perhaps his name was misspelled. Perhaps nobody recorded his death. Perhaps he simply stopped appearing in the records. And that is how some lives disappear from history. There was another danger that mountain men understood very well: distance. The Rocky Mountains were enormous. A man could travel for days without encountering another human being. If he became injured, his companions might not find him. If he became separated from his group, he could easily move in the wrong direction. And if he did not know the terrain, every attempt to find his way could take him farther from safety. Imagine a trapper following fresh tracks through a forest. He believes they belong to an elk. He leaves his companions behind for only a short while. The tracks lead toward a narrow valley. He follows. The trees become thicker. The light begins fading. Eventually, He realizes he can no longer see the trail he came from. He turns around. Nothing looks familiar. The same trees surround him, the same rocks, the same snow. He walks toward what he believes is the direction of camp. But perhaps he is walking the wrong way. By sunset, his companions are waiting. They build a fire. They assume he will return. An hour passes, then another. The fire burns lower. Still, he does not appear. Perhaps they search for him that night. Perhaps they wait until morning. But the mountains are enormous, and the weather can erase evidence quickly. A snowfall can cover footprints. A river can carry away belongings. An animal can disturb a campsite. Within days, the wilderness can conceal almost everything. This is why stories of missing mountain men became so mysterious. Sometimes there was a perfectly ordinary explanation: an accident, a storm, illness, starvation, a fall, but without a body, without witnesses, without written evidence. People naturally began filling the silence with stories. Some claimed a missing trapper had been attacked. Others believed he had wandered into unknown country. Some said he had been taken captive. Others insisted that he had simply chosen never to return. And occasionally, a man who had been presumed dead appeared years later. These stories traveled through rendezvous camps and trading posts. One mountain man would tell another. The story would change slightly. A detail would be added, a name forgotten, a location moved, and eventually, a real disappearance could become a legend. Yet beneath the legends were real dangers. The mountains did not need ghosts or monsters to claim a man. Cold was enough. Hunger was enough. A broken bone was enough. And sometimes, the greatest danger was simply being alone. As the mountain man era continued, the wilderness remained enormous, but the world around it was changing. Explorers were mapping rivers. Trading companies were organizing larger expeditions. American settlements were spreading westward, and more people were beginning to follow the trails that the mountain men had traveled. Still, there were places where almost nobody went. Deep valleys, remote passes, high mountain lakes, forests so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. Those places would become the setting for some of the most haunting stories of the frontier, because somewhere beyond the known trails, men were still disappearing, and some of them would leave behind no explanation at all. The mountains were calling, and men kept answering. By the 1820s, the Rocky Mountains had become one of the most important frontiers in North America. But this was not a frontier of comfortable roads and permanent towns. It was a frontier of rivers, forests, cliffs, snowfields, and enormous distances. For the men who entered it, every journey began with the same promise. There might be beaver, there might be wealth, there might be adventure, and perhaps there might be a new life waiting beyond the mountains. Imagine a young trapper leaving St. Louis around the year 1823. He has a rifle across his shoulder, a knife hangs from his belt, his horse carries blankets, traps, powder, food, and a few personal possessions. Behind him are streets filled with merchants and riverboats. Ahead, there is only the trail. At first, the journey follows familiar routes. The Missouri River carries boats westward. Then the traveler leaves the river. The settlements become fewer. The prairie becomes wider. The horizon seems to expand in every direction. For days, there may be nothing but grass and sky. Then one morning, the mountains appear. They rise in the distance like enormous walls. Snow shines upon their highest peaks. The young man realizes that the real journey is only beginning. Crossing the Rocky Mountains required preparation. A careless traveler could quickly find himself in serious trouble. The mountain men learned to travel light. Everything had to serve a purpose. A good rifle could provide food and protection. A strong knife could prepare meat, cut wood, repair equipment, and perform countless other tasks. A blanket could mean the difference between sleeping and freezing. A horse could carry supplies and provide mobility, but even the best equipment could not defeat a mountain storm. That was why experience mattered so much. The most valuable knowledge was often passed quietly from one man to another. Which path should be used? Which river could be crossed safely? Where could horses find grass? Where could shelter be found? Where did avalanches commonly occur? A man who knew these things could survive. A man who did not might not. The mountain men also developed an extraordinary ability to read the landscape. They studied tracks. They noticed broken branches. They recognized changes in the wind. They understood the behavior of the animals. They could often tell how recently another traveler had passed simply by looking at the ground. To modern eyes, the wilderness might appear empty. To an experienced mountain man, it was filled with information: a bent blade of grass, a footprint beside a stream, smoke rising beyond a ridge, birds suddenly taking flight. Every detail could mean something. Imagine walking through a forest in the year 1825. At first, you see nothing unusual. Then you notice a small branch broken at shoulder height. A little farther ahead, there are faint marks in the mud. A horse passed here recently, perhaps yesterday, perhaps only a few hours ago. You follow the trail. It leads toward a narrow valley. The valley opens into a meadow, and there you find a small camp. The fire has gone cold. A few ashes remain. There are horse tracks around the clearing. Perhaps the travelers left this morning, perhaps yesterday, or perhaps they never left at all. This uncertainty was part of life in the mountains. One of the greatest advantages of the mountain men was their relationship with indigenous peoples. The Rocky Mountains were not empty wilderness. Numerous native nations had lived across these lands for generations. The Shoshone, Bannock, Crow, Blackfeet, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Ute, and many others. Each had its own language, customs, territories, alliances, and traditions. The mountain men could not simply enter these lands without consequences. Some encounters were peaceful, others were tense, some became violent, but trade and diplomacy were just as important as conflict. A trapper might exchange tobacco or metal tools for food. He might receive information about a mountain pass. He might learn where buffalo had recently been seen. He might even be guided through unfamiliar territory. For some mountain men, these relationships became extremely important. Some married indigenous women. They became connected to native communities through family ties. Children were born into these relationships. And the boundary between frontier outsider and local resident became much less gray. This is one reason the history of the mountain men is more complicated than the old legends suggest. They were not simply solitary white men wandering through an empty wilderness. They lived within a much larger world of indigenous nations, traders, families, merchants, soldiers, and explorers. Still, the myth of the solitary mountain man grew, perhaps because the wilderness encouraged it. Imagine a single rider moving across a mountain valley. His horse walks slowly through tall grass. A rifle rests across the saddle. The man wears a weathered coat. His beard has grown long. There are no roads, no telephone lines, no fences, no distant city lights, only mountains. The image became one of the great symbols of the American frontier. But behind the romance was an uncomfortable truth. Isolation was dangerous. A man could become accustomed to solitude, but solitude could also kill. Suppose a trapper broke his ankle while crossing a rocky slope. His companions were 2 days away. He might have food, he might have water, but could he travel? If not, he would have to wait. For how long? A day? 3 days? A week? If his companions did not know exactly where he was, they might never find him. This was the beginning of many frontier tragedies. A man leaves camp. He intends to check his traps. He expects to return before sunset, but he falls or becomes disoriented or follows the wrong drainage. The sun disappears behind the mountains. Night arrives. He builds a fire. His companions wait. Morning comes. Still, he does not return. They begin searching. They find his footprints. The tracks lead toward a river, then disappear. Perhaps the river carried them away. Perhaps snow covered them. Perhaps the man changed direction. The search continues, but the mountains are enormous. After several days, the searchers must return to camp. Their own supplies are running low. They cannot remain forever. The missing man becomes another name in the wilderness, another story, another unanswered question. And sometimes, the missing man's companions created explanations. Maybe he was attacked by a grizzly. Maybe hostile warriors found him. Maybe he drowned. Maybe he simply became lost. There was no way to know. The mountains kept their secrets. But there was another reason men disappeared. The mountain trade itself could be dangerous. Competition over valuable hunting grounds sometimes brought different groups into conflict. A trapper traveling alone was vulnerable. A small group could be vulnerable too. A misunderstanding could turn into violence. And in an era when communication was slow, news of an incident might not reach anyone for months. Even when a man died in a known conflict, his body might never be recovered. The wilderness could become his grave. And then there were the animals. The mountain men were surrounded by wildlife, wolves, mountain lions, elk, moose, and above all, the grizzly bear. The grizzly was not simply a symbol of the wilderness. It was a real and immediate danger. An experienced mountain man knew never to treat one casually. Imagine a trapper moving through a forest during the autumn of 1827. He is searching for beaver sign beside a stream. The water is shallow. The morning is quiet. Then he notices something, a strange smell. He looks ahead. A massive grizzly stands among the trees. For one frozen moment, neither moves. The trapper knows that running would be useless. The bear is faster. He slowly reaches toward his weapon. The next few seconds may determine whether he returns to camp. These encounters became part of mountain man folklore. Some men survived terrible injuries, others did not. And when a trapper disappeared after entering bear country, the bear was often blamed. Sometimes that explanation was probably correct. Sometimes it was simply the most obvious story available. As the 1820s progressed, the mountain man world continued growing. More trading companies entered the Rockies. More men arrived from the east. The annual rendezvous became larger. The fur trade became more organized. Yet beneath all this activity, the wilderness remained unchanged. Mountains still stood where they had always stood. Rivers still cut through deep valleys. Winter storms still arrived without warning. And somewhere beyond the main trails, there were places almost nobody visited. Places where a man could walk for days without seeing another human being. Those remote regions became the final destination of some mountain men, not because they wanted to disappear, but because the wilderness offered no guarantee that anyone would find them if something went wrong. As we continue our journey, we will follow these men deeper into the high country. We will see how they built camps beside frozen rivers, how they survived months of isolation, and how the arrival of winter could turn an ordinary trapping season into a fight for life. Because for the mountain men, the greatest danger was not always the enemy they could see. Sometimes it was the mountain itself. The mountains grew larger with every mile. For the men who entered them during the early 19th century, the Rocky Mountains were not simply a place to work. They were a world of their own. A world where a man could spend weeks without seeing a town, where the weather could change within an hour, and where a single mistake could leave him fighting for his life. By the year 1825, the mountain fur trade had developed into a demanding way of life. The men who participated in it were often called mountain men. Some were experienced hunters, some were former soldiers, some were young adventurers looking for money. Others simply wanted to escape the rules and expectations of settled society. Whatever their reasons, once they entered the mountains, survival became their first responsibility. Imagine waking beside a cold mountain stream in the autumn of 1825. The fire has burned down to glowing embers. The air is sharp. Frost covers the grass. Your horse stands nearby, quietly pulling at the remaining blades. There is no cabin, no road, no nearby settlement, only a small camp surrounded by forest. You have your rifle, your knife, your traps, a few blankets, some food, and the knowledge you have gathered from years of experience. This is home, at least for now. The mountain men learned to build camps quickly. A good camp needed several things: clean water, firewood, a safe place for horses, shelter from wind, and enough nearby resources to support hunting and trapping. The location mattered enormously. A camp beside a river might provide beaver, but a river valley could also become dangerously cold. A camp beneath a steep slope might provide shelter from wind, but it could become dangerous if snow began sliding down the mountain. Every decision required judgment, and judgment came through experience. The most experienced mountain men often seemed almost calm in situations that would terrify newcomers. They had learned that panic wasted energy. If a storm arrived, you found shelter. If a horse became injured, you treated it. If food became scarce, you hunted. If the trail disappeared, you stopped and studied the landscape. The wilderness rewarded patience. It punished carelessness. One of the most important skills was fire making. Today, lighting a fire can be as simple as striking a match. For a mountain man, fire could mean survival. It provided warmth. It allowed food to be cooked. It dried clothing. It protected against the cold. And at night, it offered a psychological comfort that was difficult to measure. Imagine sitting beside a small fire high in the mountains. The flames illuminate only a small circle around you. Beyond that circle, the forest becomes completely black. You hear the wind moving through the trees. Perhaps an owl calls somewhere in the distance. Perhaps you hear branches breaking. You cannot see what caused the sound. The fire suddenly feels very small. A mountain man learned to sleep lightly. His rifle remained close. His horse was often tied nearby. He knew that an unexpected noise could mean an animal, a storm, or another human being. Yet most nights passed peacefully. The wilderness was not constantly attacking. The danger came from its unpredictability. A beautiful morning could become a dangerous afternoon. Imagine traveling through the mountains during the summer of 1826. The sky is bright, the trail is dry. The horses move comfortably. You cross a shallow stream. Everything seems perfect. Then, clouds begin building above the peaks. At first, they are small and distant. Within an hour, the sky darkens. Thunder rolls between the mountains. Rain begins falling. Then the temperature drops. Snow appears. The trail that was visible only minutes earlier begins disappearing beneath white flakes. The mountain man realizes something important. He cannot continue. He needs shelter immediately. This ability to recognize changing weather could save a man's life. Those who ignored the warning signs sometimes paid dearly. High country storms could bring freezing temperatures, deep snow, and disorientation. A man caught without shelter might become hypothermic long before he realized how serious the situation was. And once a person became exhausted, simple decisions became difficult. That was when mistakes happened. Another essential skill was finding food. Mountain men could not depend entirely upon supplies carried from civilization. They hunted, they fished, they trapped, they learned to preserve meat. A successful hunter could transform a difficult journey into a comfortable one. An unsuccessful hunter might spend several days hungry. Imagine a mountain man stalking an elk through the forest. He moves slowly. He checks the wind. He places each foot carefully. The animal remains unaware. A single shot breaks the morning silence. The elk runs. The hunter follows. If the animal's recovered, the camp will have food. If not, ammunition has been spent for nothing. Nothing was guaranteed. Beaver trapping required another kind of patience. The animal itself was rarely seen. Instead, the trapper looked for signs: cut branches, lodges, dams, tracks along muddy banks. A skilled trapper could understand a beaver's habits by studying the landscape. He would carefully place traps beneath the water, then move on to another location. The next morning, he would return. Perhaps the trap had worked, perhaps the animal had avoided it. The process repeated day after day. Hundreds of small decisions eventually determined whether a season was successful. The pelts were valuable, but carrying them through the mountains was exhausting. Imagine a pack animal loaded with heavy bundles. The trail rises sharply. The horse struggles over loose rocks. The trapper stops occasionally to check the load. A loose strap could send valuable pelts tumbling down a slope. Everything had to be secured. The mountains demanded constant attention, and yet there was beauty everywhere. Imagine reaching a high mountain meadow around the year 1828. After hours of climbing, the forest suddenly opens. A vast green meadow spreads before you. Wildflowers cover the ground. A cold stream winds through the grass. Snow-covered peaks rise beyond it. The air is perfectly clear. For a moment, the difficulties of the journey disappear. This was part of why some men remained in the mountains. They had discovered a kind of freedom that was difficult to find anywhere else. No landlord, no factory owner, no crowded street, no clock telling them when to work. Their lives were difficult, but their time belonged largely to themselves. That freedom came at a cost. They could not easily return to civilization. The longer a man remained in the mountains, the more distant ordinary life became. Some mountain men eventually married indigenous women and established families. Others formed close friendships with fellow trappers. Some remained almost completely solitary. Their relationships with indigenous nations were especially important. The mountain men relied upon native knowledge of the landscape. They traded goods. They exchanged information. They sometimes joined native communities through marriage. But relations could also be tense or violent. Different nations had different relationships with different groups of trappers. Some welcomed trade. Others viewed the newcomers as threats. The fur trade brought outsiders into lands that indigenous peoples already inhabited. The mountain world was therefore never as empty as later frontier stories sometimes suggested. It was a crowded cultural landscape. Different peoples moved through it, traded within it, and sometimes fought over it. For the mountain men, understanding those relationships could be as important as understanding the weather. A man who knew which communities welcomed traders could travel more safely. A man who ignored local customs could put himself in danger. By the late 1820s, the mountain man lifestyle had become an established part of the American frontier. Rendezvous brought together hundreds of people. Fur companies transported supplies west. Trappers spread through the valleys. The Rocky Mountains were becoming better known. But better known did not mean safe. There were still immense regions where few outsiders traveled. And every year, some men failed to return to the rendezvous. At first, nobody necessarily thought much of it. Perhaps they were late. Perhaps they had found particularly good trapping grounds. Perhaps they had chosen to remain in the mountains. But when months passed and then years, the questions began. What happened to him? Where was his camp? Where was his horse? Where were his belongings? Sometimes a clue appeared, sometimes a companion returned with a story, and sometimes there was nothing, only silence. The mountain man had entered the wilderness, and the wilderness had closed behind him. As winter approached once again, the danger became greater. Snow would soon cover the trails. Rivers would freeze. Temperatures would fall below anything a man from the east might have imagined. Those who remained in the mountains would have to endure months of isolation, and for some, winter would be their final season. The stories of the men who never returned were about to become darker. The first snow of winter could change everything. One morning, a mountain valley might still be green and open. By the next, the trail could disappear beneath a blanket of white. For the mountain men who remained in the Rocky Mountains through the coldest months of the year, winter was not simply another season. It was a test of preparation, a test of patience, and sometimes a test of whether a man would live to see spring. By the late 1820s, experienced trappers understood this very well. They knew that winter trapping could be extremely profitable. Beaver fur was at its best during the colder months. The animals' coats became thick and dense. For a skilled trapper willing to endure the cold, winter could produce valuable pelts. But every extra day spent in the mountains also increased the risk. Imagine a small camp somewhere in the Rocky Mountains around the year 1828. 3 men sit close to a fire. Their horses are sheltered nearby. Bundles of beaver pelts are stacked beneath a rough covering. Snow falls gently through the darkness. The men speak quietly. They know that the storm may last several days. Their food supply is limited. Their ammunition must be conserved. The firewood must be protected from the snow. Everything has to be carefully managed. There is no nearby store, no doctor, no warm house waiting at the end of the trail. If something goes wrong, they are on their own. The mountain men often built temporary shelters from whatever the landscape provided. Logs, branches, animal hides. Snow itself could become insulation. The goal was simple: create a small space where body heat could be preserved and wind could be kept outside. Inside such a shelter, a fire became the center of life. Wet clothing was dried beside it. Meat was cooked above it. Coffee or water was heated over it. At night, men wrapped themselves in blankets and buffalo robes. Even then, the cold could be brutal. A fire could go out, a blanket could become damp, a horse could become sick. One careless mistake could have consequences that were impossible to reverse. And then there was hunger. Winter hunting was unpredictable. Animals were harder to find. Deep snow made travel exhausting. A hunter might spend an entire day searching without finding enough game. Imagine a mountain man returning to camp after sunset. His shoulders are covered with snow. His boots are soaked. His hands are numb. He has brought back only a few small pieces of meat. The other men look at him. Nobody complains. They simply divide the food carefully. Tomorrow, they will hunt again. This was the reality of winter survival. Every meal mattered, every bullet mattered, every horse mattered. A horse was more than transportation. It carried supplies, it carried pelts. It helped a man travel quickly when necessary. If the animal died, the trapper lost much of his ability to move. For that reason, experienced mountain men searched constantly for winter grazing areas. A horse could survive surprisingly difficult conditions if it could find enough grass beneath the snow. But deep snow could make even that impossible. Imagine waking one morning to discover that a blizzard has covered the valley. The horses are barely visible. Snow reaches their bellies. You must dig through it to reach the grass. You spend hours clearing a small area. Your hands ache from the cold, yet you continue, because if the horses die, you may be trapped. And being trapped in the mountains was one of the greatest dangers imaginable. A man could survive a difficult winter if he had food and shelter, but if he became injured, everything changed. Imagine a trapper walking beside a frozen stream during the winter of 1829. He steps onto a section of ice. It breaks. One leg plunges into freezing water. He pulls himself out. Perhaps the injury is minor. Perhaps it is not. His clothing is soaked. The temperature is far below freezing. He must get back to camp immediately. If he cannot, the cold becomes deadly. Hypothermia does not always announce itself dramatically. A person becomes tired, confused, slow. He may stop making sensible decisions. He may believe he is warm when he is actually in serious danger. For a mountain man alone in the wilderness, that could be the end. Avalanches presented another threat. The mountains were constantly moving. Snow accumulated on steep slopes. A change in temperature could weaken the layers beneath. Then, without warning, tons of snow could rush downhill. A man might hear a deep cracking sound. He might have only seconds to react. The avalanche could bury him completely. And if nobody witnessed it, there might be no search, no grave, no explanation. Spring could arrive months later and reveal nothing. This is one reason the mountains could swallow people so completely. Nature did not preserve evidence. Snow covered tracks, rivers carried away belongings, falling rocks buried camps, wild animals scattered remains. Time erased everything else. A man could disappear, and the landscape would slowly erase the signs that he had ever been there. But winter was not always a season of despair. There were moments of remarkable beauty. Imagine a clear morning after a storm. The snow-covered mountains glow beneath the first light. Smoke rises vertically from the campfire. The forest is silent. Every branch is covered in frost. The sky is so clear that distant peaks appear close enough to touch. The mountain men sometimes wrote about these moments with genuine admiration. The wilderness was dangerous, but it was also breathtaking. Perhaps that contrast explains why some men never wanted to leave. They became accustomed to the solitude, the silence, the freedom. Civilization began to feel strangely distant. A mountain man could spend months without hearing the sound of a church bell, or seeing a crowded street, or sleeping beneath a permanent roof. His world became the campfire, the river, the horse, the rifle, and the mountains. But the longer he remained, the more difficult returning could become. Some men disappeared because they died. Others may have chosen a different life. This distinction is important. When a trapper failed to appear at a rendezvous, his companions might assume the worst. But a man could deliberately remain in the wilderness. He might have married into a native community. He might have found a new trapping ground. He might have decided that civilization offered nothing he wanted. Without reliable communication, nobody could immediately know the truth. Years could pass before anyone heard another word, and so a missing man could become a legend. 1 winter, 2 winters, 3. Eventually, people stopped expecting him to return. His name might be spoken around a campfire. Someone might say that he was last seen near a certain river. Another man might remember hearing that he had gone north. A third might claim that he was killed by Indians. The story changes with every telling, and somewhere beneath all those stories, there may have been a very ordinary truth. A broken leg, a frozen river, a sudden storm, a shortage of food, or simply a decision to stay. As the years passed, the mountains continued attracting new generations of trappers. The men came looking for fortune. They came looking for adventure. They came looking for freedom. But some discovered something else. The mountains had become their home. And once a man became part of that wilderness, returning to civilization could feel almost as strange as leaving it. Still, not everyone survived long enough to make that choice. Some disappeared during winter, some never made it back to the rendezvous, and some left behind only the faintest traces of their existence. A few names survive in journals, others survive only in stories, and some have been forgotten completely. The next time we enter these mountains, we will meet the men who lived closest to danger, men who faced grizzlies, hostile weather, hunger, injury, and isolation. Because sometimes the wilderness did not need a terrible storm to claim a mountain man. Sometimes all it took was one animal, one wrong step, or one moment of bad luck. There was a particular kind of silence in the mountains, the silence that came after a man failed to return. At first, nobody panicked. A mountain man could be late. He might have found a promising stretch of river and decided to stay another night. He might have followed a trail farther than expected. He might have been delayed by weather. But eventually, someone would begin to wonder, where is he? What happened? And perhaps most frightening of all, did anyone see him leave? During the great years of the Rocky Mountain fur trade, disappearances were not unusual. The wilderness was enormous. The men were scattered across hundreds of miles. Communication was slow, and there were no official search teams waiting in nearby towns. If a trapper disappeared deep in the mountains, his companions were often the only people who might ever look for him. Imagine a small camp beside a river around the year 1830. 3 men have been waiting for a fourth. He left early that morning to check a line of traps. He promised to return before sunset. The sun has now disappeared behind the mountains. Darkness settles over the trees. His horse is still tied beside the camp. That detail makes the others uneasy. A man might become lost, but why would he leave his horse behind? They light another fire. They wait. An hour passes, then another. Finally, 2 men take their rifles and begin searching. They follow the trail leading away from camp. At first, the tracks are easy to see. Boot prints, broken branches, a few marks in the snow. Then the trail reaches a stream, and suddenly, nothing. The water is moving quickly. The opposite bank is covered with rocks. There are no obvious footprints. The men search for hours. They call his name. Only the mountains answer. This kind of uncertainty haunted the frontier. A body could provide an explanation. A body could tell a story. Without one, almost anything was possible. Perhaps he had drowned. Perhaps he had fallen. Perhaps he had encountered a bear. Perhaps another group had attacked him. Perhaps he had become lost. Or perhaps he had simply chosen not to return. The mountain men knew all of these possibilities. They had seen enough tragedy to understand how quickly life could change. One of the greatest dangers was the grizzly bear. To modern audiences, the stories of grizzly attacks can sound almost legendary. But these enormous animals were very real. They shared the same valleys and riverbanks where mountain men hunted and trapped. A trapper could encounter one while moving through thick brush. He could surprise a bear while approaching a carcass, or he could accidentally come between a mother and her cubs. Imagine a mountain man traveling through the mountains in the year 1831. The morning is cool. He is following a narrow trail beside a river. Suddenly, he smells something unusual. He stops. Ahead, between the trees, is a massive grizzly. The animal has not noticed him. The trapper freezes. He knows that running would be useless. The bear is too fast. He slowly steps backward. One step, then another. The animal raises its head. For a moment, the entire forest seems silent. Then the bear turns away. The trapper waits several minutes before moving. He returns to camp with a story he will probably tell for the rest of his life. Not every encounter ended so peacefully. Some men survived terrible attacks, others did not. And if a lone trapper disappeared after entering bear country, people naturally suspected the worst. But wildlife was not the only danger. The mountains themselves could be deadly. A narrow trail along a cliff might collapse. A horse could stumble. A man could slip on wet rock. A river crossing could go wrong. A firearm could misfire. An infected wound could become fatal. Medical treatment in the mountains was primitive. A deep cut could become infected. A broken bone could leave a man unable to travel. There was no modern ambulance waiting nearby. No helicopter. No hospital. A man who suffered a serious injury might have only his companions and whatever knowledge they possessed. Imagine a trapper breaking his leg during the year 1832. His companions make a splint from branches. They wrap the injury with cloth, they give him water, they build a shelter. Then they face an impossible decision. Can they carry him if they stay? Will they have enough food if they leave? Can they return with help? The mountains offer no easy answer. Sometimes the injured man might recover. Other times he would never walk again. And occasionally his companions might be forced to leave him behind. Those were decisions that could haunt a man for the rest of his life. Disease was another invisible enemy. A mountain camp could appear healthy one day and become dangerous the next. Poor food, cold temperatures, exhaustion, dirty water, injuries, all weaken the body. A simple illness that might have been treatable in a town could become deadly hundreds of miles from civilization. Imagine a trapper lying beside a fire during the winter of 1833. He has a fever. His companions know something is wrong. They give him water, they wrap him in blankets, but there is no doctor, no medicine chest, no way to know what disease he has. The men continue trapping because they must. Food still has to be found. Horses still need care. The sick man grows weaker. Outside, snow continues falling. The mountains remain indifferent. Sometimes the man survives. Sometimes he becomes another forgotten grave. But perhaps the most dangerous enemy was not an animal, or a storm, or disease. It was isolation. A mountain man could make a mistake and have nobody nearby to correct it. Imagine traveling alone through unfamiliar country in the year 1834. You reach a fork in a mountain valley. Two trails appear. One leads north. The other seems to follow the river west. You believe the western trail will eventually return toward camp, so you choose it. Hours pass. The mountains become unfamiliar. You stop. Look around. Nothing looks right. You turn back. But now, which direction did you come from? The human brain can become surprisingly unreliable in unfamiliar landscapes. A person may believe he is walking straight while gradually turning in a wide circle. Without landmarks, a traveler can become trapped in the same area without realizing it. If food runs low, fear begins. Fear leads to rushed decisions, and rushed decisions make the situation worse. The mountain men learned to stop when they were uncertain. Experienced travelers would sometimes remain in place rather than continuing blindly. A fire could be built, water found, shelter prepared. Then wait. Waiting could save a life. Yet not everyone had that experience. Young men sometimes believed courage meant moving forward. They learned too late that the mountains rewarded caution. There were also conflicts between different groups. The fur trade brought together people from many cultures: trappers, indigenous communities, Spanish and Mexican traders, American merchants, soldiers, missionaries, travelers. Relations could be peaceful. trade could create friendships. Families could form through marriage. But competition over hunting grounds and resources could also lead to violence. A lone trapper traveling through unfamiliar territory was vulnerable. If he disappeared, the circumstances might never be recorded accurately. News traveled slowly. One rumor could become another. A real incident could become a legend. And legends were everywhere. Mountain men told stories around their fires. They spoke about men who had vanished. They described distant valleys where nobody dared to travel. They talked about abandoned cabins, empty camps, unmarked graves. Some stories were probably exaggerated. Others were almost certainly true. And some we simply cannot know. That uncertainty is what makes these stories so haunting. Because somewhere beneath the legends, there were real people. Men with families, friends, ambitions, fears. Men who once sat beside a fire just like the one we imagine tonight. They may have believed they would return. They may have promised someone they would. Perhaps they imagined themselves riding back into St. Louis with a successful season behind them. But the mountains sometimes had other plans. By the middle of the 19th century, the world around the mountain men was beginning to change. The fur trade was declining. Fashion was changing. Silk hats were becoming more popular. Beaver populations had been reduced in many areas. The great rendezvous era was beginning to fade. Yet some men remained in the mountains. They had spent too many years there to simply walk away. For them, the wilderness was no longer a temporary workplace. It was home. And that would create an entirely new mystery. Because some men did not disappear because they died. Some may have disappeared because they chose a life where nobody was expected to find them. As we continue, we will follow the fading years of the mountain man era, and we will explore the men who seemed to vanish between two worlds, civilization behind them, and the endless mountains ahead. By the 1830s, the world of the mountain men had begun to change. The Rocky Mountains were still enormous. The rivers still ran cold and clear. The forests still stretched for miles. But the men who once entered the wilderness as temporary visitors were beginning to discover something unexpected. For some, the mountains had become home. They had learned the trails. They knew the seasons. They knew where the animals gathered. They had formed friendships with indigenous families. Some had married and raised children in native communities. Others had built small cabins in remote valleys. They were no longer simply passing through. They had become part of the landscape. Imagine a mountain valley around the year 1834. A small cabin stands beside a quiet stream. Smoke rises from a stone chimney. A horse grazes near the doorway. Inside, a trapper has arranged his belongings carefully. A rifle rests against the wall. Animal hides hang from wooden beams. A few iron tools sit beside a cooking pot. There is nothing luxurious here, but there is comfort. This is no longer a temporary camp. It is a home. The man who lives there may spend months without visiting a town. He knows exactly where to find water. He knows which slopes remain clear of deep snow. He knows where elk pass during autumn. And he knows the sound of the river outside his door. For men like these, leaving the mountains may have seemed almost unnecessary. Civilization had its advantages, but it also had rules, taxes, laws, crowded streets, competition. The mountain world offered something different, freedom. Yet the old fur trade was beginning to weaken. Beaver populations had declined in many heavily trapped areas. Fashion was changing. Silk hats were becoming increasingly popular in Europe and America. The enormous profits that had once attracted hundreds of trappers were becoming harder to find. The great annual rendezvous still brought people together, but the gatherings were beginning to lose some of their importance. The era was slowly ending, and that created a strange situation. The mountains remained, but the reason for entering them was disappearing. Some men returned east, others became traders. Some became guides for explorers. Some joined the growing overland traffic, and some simply stayed. These men became part of the legends of the American West. Imagine an old mountain man sitting beside a fire around the year 1840. His beard is gray, his clothing is worn, his rifle shows years of use. A younger traveler asks him about the mountains. The old man smiles. He begins telling stories. He remembers a winter when the snow was deeper than a horse's belly. He remembers a river crossing that nearly killed 3 men. He remembers a bear that followed his camp for 2 days. And then he mentions someone who never returned. Perhaps a trapper named only by his first name. Perhaps a friend whose last known camp was beside a distant river. The younger listener leans closer. What happened to him? The old man shakes his head. Nobody knows. That simple answer was enough to create a legend. One of the most famous mountain men was Jedediah Smith. His story shows both the extraordinary possibilities and the terrible risks of life in the wilderness. Smith was not simply a trapper. He was an explorer. He traveled through enormous portions of the American West and became one of the first Americans to explore large areas of the Rocky Mountains, Great Basin, and Pacific Coast. He survived hardships that would have killed many others, but even a man as experienced as Smith could not escape the dangers of the frontier. In 1831, Smith was traveling along the Santa Fe Trail when he disappeared. He had gone ahead of his companions in search of water. He never returned. His companions waited, then searched, but Smith's body was never recovered. The exact circumstances of his death remain uncertain. He may have encountered Comanche warriors. He may have been killed in another confrontation. The details were never fully established. And so, one of the most famous mountain men in American history became one of the men who never returned. His story is a reminder that even extraordinary experience could not guarantee survival. The wilderness remained unpredictable. There were other men whose stories were less famous, names that appeared briefly in journals, trappers mentioned in company records, travelers remembered by companions. Then, silence. Sometimes a disappearance was recorded, sometimes it was not. Imagine a fur company clerk sitting at a rough wooden desk in the year 1841. He is checking a list of men. One name has not appeared at the rendezvous. He makes a small mark beside it. Perhaps the man is late. Perhaps he is trapping farther north. The clerk does not know. Months pass. The name disappears beneath newer entries. Eventually, nobody asks anymore. This is how history can lose people, not through a dramatic event, but through silence. The frontier was filled with such silence. A man could disappear hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement. His friends might search briefly, then continue their own journeys. They had to survive too. The mountains did not allow people to stop forever for the missing, and so the search ended. But some disappearances were connected to a different kind of frontier life. The mountain men did not always remain isolated from indigenous communities. Many formed deep relationships. Trade created familiarity. Marriage created families. Children grew up speaking more than one language. Some mountain men adopted native clothing and customs. Others became so integrated into indigenous communities that returning to American settlements no longer felt natural. To outsiders, such men might appear to have vanished, but perhaps they had simply chosen another life. Imagine a former trapper living beside a native village around the year 1845. He wakes with the sunrise. His children are nearby. Horses graze along the river. He knows the surrounding country intimately. He has not visited St. Louis in years. If someone in the East asked what happened to him, they might say he disappeared, but he did not necessarily die. He simply stopped returning. That distinction matters. Not every mountain man who vanished from American records was necessarily a victim of the wilderness. Some may have deliberately remained beyond the reach of settled society. For them, the mountains offered a kind of freedom that civilization could not provide. Yet the wilderness was becoming harder to escape. Explorers were mapping more territory. Immigrants were following Western trails. Military expeditions crossed the plains. Trading posts became more permanent. The same routes once used only by trappers were now being traveled by thousands of people. The mountain man's world was shrinking, and with it, the mystery of the truly unknown wilderness was beginning to disappear. Still, there remained remote places where almost nobody traveled. High valleys, hidden passes, dense forests, desert basins, places where a man could disappear and remain missing for decades. One such story might begin with a simple decision. A trapper leaves camp to check his traps. He expects to return that evening. He does not. His companions wait. The next morning, they follow his trail. It leads through thick forest, then across a river, then up a steep slope. Eventually, the tracks disappear. There is no body, no broken rifle, no abandoned pack, nothing. The men search for several days. Finally, they return. Years later, someone might discover an old rusted trap in the same valley. Perhaps it belonged to him, perhaps not. Nobody can be certain. The mountains keep the answer. As the fur trade faded during the 1840s, a new era began. The great migration of settlers toward Oregon and California was accelerating. Thousands of people would soon follow trails across lands the mountain men had explored. Wagons would replace pack horses. Roads would replace footpaths. Military forts would replace temporary camps. The wilderness would become increasingly connected to the rest of the nation. But the mountain men had opened the door. Their knowledge of rivers and passes helped later travelers. Their maps improved understanding of the West. Their stories inspired generations of Americans. And their disappearances became part of the mythology of the frontier. The mountain man era was ending, but the mountains themselves were not finished with their secrets. There were still men who would enter the high country, still expeditions that would fail, still camps that would be abandoned, and still names that would vanish from the records. Because even as civilization moved west, the Rocky Mountains remained capable of swallowing a man without a trace, and sometimes the last person to see him alive was another mountain man, standing beside a campfire, watching his companion disappear into the trees. The mountains did not care whether a man was famous. They did not care whether he had survived 100 difficult journeys. They did not care how many rivers he had crossed, or how many winters he had endured. One careless moment could still be enough. By the middle of the 19th century, the great era of the mountain men was beginning to fade, but the wilderness remained. And as more Americans traveled west, the mountains began collecting a new generation of stories. Some belonged to explorers, some belonged to immigrants, some belonged to soldiers, and some belonged to men who disappeared. Imagine the Rocky Mountains around the year 1845. A narrow trail follows a river through thick pine forest. The morning is cold. Mist hangs above the water. A lone rider moves slowly along the trail. His horse carries a small pack. The man occasionally stops to study the ground. He sees tracks, elk, perhaps another horse, maybe something else. He continues. There is no reason to believe that anything unusual will happen. And that was often how frontier tragedies began, not with a warning, but with an ordinary morning. The mountain men had developed a habit of traveling alone or in very small groups. There were advantages. A small group could move quietly. It needed less food. It could travel through narrow valleys. But the disadvantage was obvious. If something happened, there might be nobody nearby to help. A broken saddle could become a serious problem. A sick horse could leave a man stranded. An injured traveler might not be able to walk. And if a man disappeared, there might be no witnesses. This became increasingly important as the fur trade declined. Many experienced trappers began working as guides. They led explorers through difficult country. They showed travelers mountain passes. They explained rivers and trails. Their knowledge had become valuable for a new generation of Western travelers. One of the most important changes came from the growing movement along the Oregon Trail. Thousands of immigrants were beginning to cross the continent. They traveled in large wagon trains. Compared with the mountain men, their journeys looked completely different. Imagine an immigrant wagon train in the year 1847. Dozens of wooden wagons move slowly across the plains. Oxen pull heavily loaded carts. Children walk beside their parents. Women prepare food beside temporary camps. Men ride ahead to search for water. The journey is exhausting, but the travelers have something the old mountain men often lacked: numbers. A wagon train might contain dozens of people. If one person became sick, others could help. If a wagon broke, several men could repair it. If danger appeared, there were rifles in many hands. Still, once the wagon roads entered the mountains, the travelers often depended upon people who already knew the country. Mountain men became guides. Their knowledge of rivers and passes could save lives. They understood that the shortest route on a map was not always the safest route on the ground. A mountain pass could be blocked by snow. A river could become impossible to cross. A trail might be too steep for wagons. A route that looked perfect in summer could become deadly later in the year. Imagine a guide standing before a wagon train during the autumn of 1848. He studies the mountains ahead. The immigrants are eager to continue, but the guide knows something they do not. Winter is coming. He tells them they should not attempt the high pass yet. Some travelers listen, others are impatient. They want to reach their destination. This kind of decision would become one of the defining challenges of Western migration. The mountains rewarded patience. They punished desperation. And every year, someone misjudged them. As more travelers arrived, the meaning of the wilderness began to change. For the old mountain man, the mountains were a home and workplace. For the immigrant, they were an obstacle. For the government, they were territory. For the explorer, they were a puzzle. For the mountain man who had lived there for decades, they were something closer to a language. He could read them. Others could not. That knowledge made men like him valuable. But it also meant that some disappeared while traveling beyond the routes known to most immigrants. Imagine an experienced guide leaving a temporary camp in the year 1850. He tells his companions that he will return before evening. He knows the country. He has traveled through the valley many times. Nobody worries. But darkness arrives. The guide does not return. His companions wait through the night. At sunrise, they begin searching. They find his horse. It is standing quietly near a stream. The saddle is still attached. His rifle is gone. There are tracks leading toward the trees. Then, nothing. The search continues. But the forest is enormous. The trail crosses rocky ground. Footprints become impossible to distinguish. Rain begins falling. Within hours, The evidence has almost disappeared. The men return to camp. The guide is never seen again. Perhaps he fell. Perhaps he encountered another group. Perhaps he was injured somewhere beyond the search area. Perhaps he deliberately chose another route. Nobody knows. And this uncertainty was becoming part of Western life. The more people traveled through the mountains, the more stories they carried home. Some stories were exaggerated. Others were based upon genuine events. A traveler might hear about a cabin discovered deep in the mountains. The cabin appears abandoned. Inside, there are old tools, a rusted rifle, a broken chair, perhaps a few bones outside. Who lived there? When did they leave? Why? Sometimes the answers could be found. Sometimes they could not. The abandoned cabin became one of the most powerful images of the frontier. It represented a life that had once existed and then disappeared. Imagine entering such a cabin around the year 1855. The roof is damaged. Pine needles cover the floor. An old iron pot rests beside the fireplace. The window is broken. A faded piece of leather hangs from a wall. Outside, the forest has begun reclaiming the clearing. Trees grow where a path once existed. There is no sign explaining who built the cabin. Perhaps it belonged to a mountain man, perhaps a family, perhaps a hunting party without records. It becomes a mystery, and mysteries naturally grow with age. The old mountain men understood this. They had heard stories their entire lives. A missing trapper became a ghost story. An abandoned camp became evidence of a massacre. A distant footprint became proof that someone had survived for decades. The truth became mixed with imagination. Yet beneath the legends, there were still genuine disappearances. Men died far from civilization. Their remains were never recovered. Their companions sometimes did not even know exactly where they had fallen. The mountains could preserve a story or erase it completely. During the 1850s, the American West changed at extraordinary speed. Gold discoveries drew thousands of people toward California. New trails were established. Military expeditions crossed remote country. Surveyors mapped valleys and rivers. The old world of the mountain men was becoming surrounded. Places that once seemed impossibly distant were now being visited by travelers every year. Yet some men resisted the change. They continued living beyond the settlements. They remained hunters, guides, trappers, or simply wanderers. Perhaps they did not want to return. Perhaps they had nowhere to return to. The frontier had become their identity. Imagine an aging mountain man standing on a ridge around the year 1858. Below him, a wagon road crosses the valley. Farther away, a new settlement is beginning to grow. He watches silently. He remembers when the valley was empty, when only horses and wildlife moved through it. Now, the world is arriving. He knows that his era is ending, but he also knows that beyond the next ridge, there are still places where no road exists, places where a man can disappear, places where the old wilderness remains untouched. And so he turns away from the road. He rides toward the mountains. Perhaps he will return, perhaps he will not. This is where the line between history and legend becomes difficult to see. The mountain men were real. Their dangers were real. Their disappearances were real. But the stories told about them grew larger with every generation. Some men became legendary heroes. Others became mysterious figures who supposedly lived for decades in hidden valleys. And some were remembered only because somebody once asked a simple question: where did he go? The answer was sometimes written down. More often, it was not. And as the 19th century moved forward, the mountains continued to hide their answers beneath snow, stone, and forest. But there was one final chapter waiting. The age of the mountain men was disappearing. The fur trade was fading, the great trails were becoming roads, and the wilderness was being mapped. Yet men would continue entering those mountains. Some would go searching for gold, some for adventure, some for solitude, and some would never come back. The trail was becoming crowded. For generations, a mountain man could travel through the Rocky Mountains and expect to see little more than wildlife, scattered indigenous camps, and the occasional trading party. But by the middle of the 19th century, that was changing. The wilderness was still enormous, yet more people were entering it every year. Wagon trains crossed the plains. Military expeditions moved through the passes. Gold seekers followed rumors toward California. Surveyors measured rivers and mountain ranges. And behind all of them came the roads. Slowly, the isolated world of the mountain men was being connected to the rest of America. Imagine standing beside a mountain trail around the year 1852. A stream runs quietly through a valley. Pine trees rise along the slopes. Snow still covers the highest peaks. Then you hear something unfamiliar. Wheels. A wagon appears between the trees. Behind it comes another, then another. Families are traveling west. They stop beside the stream to water their animals. The mountain man watching from a distant ridge understands what this means. The old wilderness is changing, yet the mountains remain dangerous. The new travelers often have little experience with them. They may know how to farm, they may know how to repair a wagon, they may know how to shoot, but they do not necessarily understand mountain weather. They do not know every river crossing. They do not recognize the signs of an approaching storm, and they may not understand how quickly a beautiful landscape can become deadly. That is why experienced mountain men became valuable guides. A man who had spent 20 years traveling through the Rockies possessed knowledge that could not be learned from a map. He knew where to cross, where to camp, when to move, and when to turn back. Imagine an old trapper standing beside a wagon train in the year 1853. He looks toward a high mountain pass. The emigrants are eager to continue, but the trapper notices dark clouds gathering above the peaks. He shakes his head. Not today. The travelers may be disappointed, but he knows something they do not. A storm in the mountains can arrive with terrifying speed. Snow can cover a trail in a matter of hours. A wagon train caught at high elevation may become trapped. Animals can die, food can run out, and once the snow becomes deep enough, even experienced guides may struggle to escape. Some of the most haunting stories of the American West emerge from such journeys. Families entered the mountains expecting to reach the other side. Some succeeded. Others became stranded. The wilderness did not distinguish between experienced mountain men and inexperienced travelers. It could take anyone. But the old trappers possessed one advantage. They understood that survival often depended upon knowing when not to continue. That lesson had been learned through years of hardship, and sometimes through the loss of friends. Imagine an evening camp around the year 1854. Several older mountain men sit beside a fire. Younger travelers have gathered around them. Someone asks about a particular trail. One of the older men becomes quiet. He knows the trail. Years earlier, a friend disappeared there. The man had been traveling alone. He never reached the next camp. Searchers found a few tracks, then nothing. The story has been told many times, but nobody knows what really happened. Perhaps the man fell. Perhaps he became lost. Perhaps he froze during a sudden storm. Perhaps he continued into another valley. The older trapper only knows one thing. He never came back. Stories like this became part of the oral history of the frontier. They were warnings as much as entertainment. The mountains were not a place to take lightly. One wrong decision could separate a man from his companions, and once separated, finding him could be nearly impossible. Consider how different the landscape looked before modern technology. There were no detailed satellite images, no GPS, no emergency beacons, no reliable way to contact someone hundreds of miles away. A traveler depended upon landmarks, the position of the sun, the shape of mountains, the direction of rivers. A mistake in navigation could become a disaster. Imagine a lone rider in the year 1855. He believes he is traveling south, but the mountains have confused his sense of direction. The valley curves. The sun disappears behind clouds. He continues. Hours later, he realizes the terrain looks unfamiliar. He turns around, but the landscape now seems equally unfamiliar in the opposite direction. He has become lost. At first, he remains calm. He has food, he has water, he has a horse. He believes he will find the trail again. But night arrives. The temperature falls. The horse becomes nervous. The man builds a fire. Tomorrow, he tells himself, he will find the trail. Morning comes. He chooses a direction and begins riding. This is where a dangerous cycle can begin. Every wrong decision increases the distance from safety. The more anxious the traveler becomes, the faster he moves. The faster he moves, the less carefully he reads the landscape. Eventually, he may become completely disoriented. This is why experienced mountain men often followed rivers. Water could provide a reliable route through unfamiliar terrain. But even rivers could be dangerous. Spring runoff could transform a calm stream into a violent torrent. A crossing that was safe yesterday might be impossible today. Imagine a trapper approaching a river in the year 1856. The water is cold and fast. His horse refuses to enter. He studies the current. There is no bridge, no ferry. He could try to cross it or wait. Waiting means losing time. Crossing means risking his horse and supplies. The mountain man chooses carefully. That ability to wait was one of the greatest survival skills. The wilderness often rewarded patience, yet patience could not protect everyone. Some men died from accidents that happened in seconds. A horse stumbled, a rifle discharged, a rock broke loose, a river rose, an avalanche fell, a man disappeared, and then the landscape returned to silence. There was another kind of disappearance that became increasingly common during this changing era. Men who simply walked away from their former lives. A trapper might decide that he no longer wanted to return east. He might have built a family among indigenous people. He might have established a small ranch. He might have joined another community. Or he might have moved deeper into the wilderness. To the people who knew him in the east, he had disappeared, but perhaps he had simply chosen another life. This possibility makes some frontier mysteries particularly difficult to solve. When an old record says that a man was never heard from again, it does not necessarily mean that he died immediately. It means only that the historical trail ended. The truth could be tragic, or ordinary, or completely unknown, and sometimes the lack of information became the story itself. By the late 1850s, the mountain man era was clearly fading. The beaver trade was no longer what it had once been. Many famous rendezvous gatherings belonged to the past. New economic opportunities were appearing elsewhere. But the knowledge of the mountain men remained valuable. They had mapped routes through difficult country. They had described rivers. They had identified passes. They had learned where winter could trap travelers. Their experience helped open the West to people who followed. There was an irony in this. The men who loved the wilderness helped make it easier for others to enter. The trails they used became routes for emigrants. The passes they discovered became roads. The knowledge they collected became maps. And the mountains that had once seemed unreachable became increasingly accessible. Yet beyond those mapped routes, mystery remained. There were valleys that few outsiders had visited. There were abandoned cabins whose owners were unknown. There were graves without names. There were trails that disappeared into forests. And there were men whose final journeys were never explained. Imagine finding an old campsite deep in the mountains around the year 1860. The fire pit is cold. A few stones form a rough circle nearby. A rusted piece of metal lies beneath the grass. Perhaps a broken trap, perhaps a piece of cooking equipment. You look around. There is no cabin, no grave, no name, only the quiet forest. Who stood beside that fire? How long ago? Did the person return to civilization, or did he die somewhere nearby? The mountains provide no answer. That is the haunting truth about many frontier mysteries. We want a final explanation, but history does not always give us one. Sometimes, the evidence simply ends. As the 19th century continued, the mountains would see soldiers, prospectors, surveyors, miners, ranchers, and explorers. The old mountain men would become memories. Their clothing would become part of frontier imagery. Their stories would become legends. But somewhere beneath the romantic image of the rugged trapper were real men who experienced extraordinary hardship. Some returned, some stayed, and some never returned at all. The next chapter of our journey will take us deeper into the places where those stories became especially dark, into abandoned camps, forgotten cabins, remote valleys, and the traces that sometimes remained after a man had vanished. Because even when a mountain man disappeared, the wilderness occasionally left behind a clue. The mountains sometimes kept a strange record of the people who entered them, not in books, not in official reports, but in the things they left behind: a cold fire pit, a broken trap, an abandoned cabin, a rusted rifle, a few scraps of leather beneath the trees. To someone passing through years later, these objects might seem insignificant, but to historians, they can become clues, fragments of a life that ended somewhere beyond the last known trail. By the middle of the 19th century, stories of abandoned camps had become part of the mythology of the American West. Imagine walking through a remote mountain valley around the year 1860. The forest is quiet. Tall pines rise toward the sky. A narrow stream moves between moss-covered stones. There is no road nearby, no town, no smoke on the horizon. Then, you notice something unusual: a flat area among the trees. The ground appears strangely clear. You step closer. There is an old fire ring. The stones have been blackened by years of smoke. Nearby lies a piece of rusted iron, perhaps a trap, perhaps part of a cooking pot. You look around. There is no cabin, no grave, no sign explaining who once lived there. Only the remains of a forgotten camp. Who built the fire? How long did they stay? Where did they go? The mountains offer no answer. This is what makes abandoned places so powerful. They suggest a story without telling us how it ended. A mountain man might establish a temporary camp beside a river. He could remain there for several weeks. Perhaps he was trapping beaver. Perhaps he was waiting for winter to pass. Perhaps he planned to meet companions at a distant rendezvous. Then something happened. He left and never returned. Years later, another traveler might discover the campsite. By then, the fire pit would be cold, the tracks long gone, the wooden shelter collapsing. Animals would move through the clearing. Trees would slowly reclaim the ground. The wilderness would begin erasing the evidence. But sometimes, the evidence survived. A metal tool could remain for generations. A stone chimney could stand long after the roof collapsed. A trail might remain visible beneath the forest. And occasionally, a grave could be found, unmarked, forgotten, half hidden beneath grass and leaves. Imagine discovering such a grave around the year 1870. Two rough stones mark either end. There is no name, no date, no explanation. Perhaps the person died during a winter storm. Perhaps disease took him. Perhaps an accident occurred. The grave tells us only one thing with certainty. Someone was here, someone lived, and someone died far from home. For historians, these small discoveries can be frustrating. The physical evidence may survive, while the identity disappears. An old bottle does not tell us who drank from it. A rifle does not tell us who carried it. A cabin does not tell us who built it. And a grave does not always tell us who lies beneath it. This was especially true in the 19th century West. Records were scattered. Names were spelled differently. Mountain men often used nicknames. Some could not read or write. Others simply had no reason to document every journey. A man could spend decades in the wilderness and leave behind almost nothing. This is one reason the history of the mountain men is filled with uncertainty. But there were moments when clues survived. A journal entry, a letter, a trading company record, a story told by a companion. Sometimes these fragments allow us to reconstruct what happened. Other times, they only make the mystery deeper. Imagine a fur company ledger from around the year 1838. A clerk carefully records the names of men who arrived at a trading post. One familiar name is missing. The clerk makes a note. Did not return. That may be all. 4 words. No dramatic description. No final scene. No explanation. Just a quiet record that someone was gone. Perhaps the clerk knew more. Perhaps he did not. Maybe the man had died months earlier. Maybe he had moved to another region. Maybe he had joined an indigenous community. The record cannot tell us. This is how many lives disappear from history, not with a dramatic ending, but with a missing name. There was also another source of mystery. The mountains were filled with rumors. A traveler might arrive at a trading post and hear about a strange cabin deep in the wilderness. Someone claims a trapper has lived there alone for 20 years. Another person insists the cabin has been abandoned for decades. A third says the man who built it was killed by a bear. The story changes depending upon who tells it. This was normal on the frontier. News traveled slowly. People depended upon word of mouth. A story could travel hundreds of miles before being written down. By then, the original event might have changed completely. A small accident could become a battle. A missing traveler could become a mysterious hermit. A lonely grave could become the resting place of a legendary outlaw. The mountains encouraged such stories because they provided so many places for them to hide. Imagine a narrow valley in the year 1862. The walls rise steeply on both sides. A river cuts through the center. The valley is surrounded by dense forest. Few people travel here. At the far end, there is a small wooden cabin. The roof has partially collapsed. The door hangs open. Inside, dust covers the floor. An old iron stove sits against the wall. A wooden table has fallen onto its side. Near the fireplace is a rusted knife. There is no body. No personal letter, no name, only evidence that someone once lived here. Perhaps the cabin belonged to a former mountain man who decided to remain in the wilderness. Perhaps a prospector built it years later, without records. We cannot know. But imagine finding the cabin for the first time. You would naturally wonder, who was he? Did he live here alone? Did he have a family? Why did he leave? Did he choose to go, or was he forced to? The questions are almost more powerful than the answers. There was another problem for those who searched for missing men. The landscape itself changed. Rivers changed course. Forests grew. Fires destroyed camps. Floods moved rocks and soil. Snow buried trails. A mountain pass could look completely different after several decades. This meant that even a determined search might fail. Imagine a group of men searching for a missing trapper in the year 1865. They know where he was last seen. They follow his trail, but the trail ends beside a river. They search downstream. Nothing. They climb the surrounding slopes. Nothing. They continue for several days. Still nothing. Eventually, they have to stop. Food is running low. Their own families are waiting. The search ends. The missing man's fate becomes unknown. Perhaps decades later, a hunter finds a few bones. Perhaps he finds nothing. The mystery remains, and sometimes the most reasonable explanation is also the simplest. The man died in an accident. No conspiracy, no hidden enemy, no supernatural event. Just the enormous and unforgiving wilderness. This is important when looking at frontier legends. The mountains did not need monsters to become dangerous. They already possessed enough dangers of their own. A man could become lost, a horse could fall, a storm could arrive, an injury could become infected, food could run out, a river could rise. A single mistake could end a life. And because help was so far away, the wilderness often had the final word. By the 1860s, the old mountain man world was almost gone. The fur trade had declined. Rendezvous had become memories. Railroads were beginning to change Western travel. Settlements were expanding. Military posts were increasing. The men who once moved freely through the mountains were becoming guides, ranchers, scouts, or simply old men remembering another era. Yet their stories remained. Stories of camps discovered long after their owners vanished. Stories of men who left for the mountains and never returned. Stories of trails leading into forests where no one knew what happened next. And perhaps that is why the mountain men continue to fascinate us. They lived on the edge of certainty. Every journey could become a story. Every disappearance could become a mystery. Every abandoned camp could become a question. The mountains still contain places where those questions may never be answered. And somewhere beneath the trees, perhaps there are still traces of men whose names have been forgotten. Men who once lit a fire, cooked a meal, tied their horses nearby, looked toward the mountains, and believed they would return, but they never did. The old mountain man world was disappearing. Not suddenly, not with one final battle. It faded slowly, almost quietly. A rendezvous that once brought hundreds of trappers together became a memory. A trail once known only to experienced hunters became a road. A lonely trading post became a permanent settlement. And the men who had once lived freely among the mountains began to grow old. By the 1860s, the Rocky Mountains were no longer the mysterious edge of the known world they had been a generation earlier. Maps were improving. Explorers were traveling farther. Settlers were arriving in increasing numbers. The wilderness was being measured, named, and divided. But even as civilization moved westward, the mountains remained capable of swallowing a man. Perhaps that is why stories of the old mountain men survived. They belonged to a disappearing world, a world where a man could leave a settlement with little more than a rifle, a horse, and a blanket, and spend months beyond the reach of civilization. Imagine an aging trapper standing beside a river around the year 1862. His hair has turned gray. His hands are rough from decades of work. He watches a wagon train moving slowly through the valley. The sight reminds him of another time. There was once a period when he could travel for weeks without seeing a wagon. Now, the valley is filling with people. The mountain man knows that his world is ending, but perhaps he also understands something the newcomers do not. The mountains will remain dangerous long after the fur trade disappears. The first great change came from transportation. Trails that once required experienced guides were becoming easier to follow. Wagons moved farther west. Military roads connected isolated forts. Eventually, railroads would cross regions that had once taken months to reach. The great distances of the continent were shrinking. For the old mountain men, This could be unsettling. Their greatest advantage had always been knowledge. They knew where the trails were. They knew where water could be found. They knew which passes were safe. They knew how to survive. But now, others were learning the same country. Imagine a former trapper returning to a valley in the year 1865. He expects to find the same quiet meadow he remembers from decades earlier. Instead, there is a road. Fresh wagon tracks cut through the grass. A small settlement stands beside the river. Smoke rises from several chimneys. He stops his horse. For a moment, he simply watches. The valley is recognizable, and yet, it is no longer the place he remembers. The mountains have not changed. The people have. This transformation also changed the meaning of disappearance. Earlier in the century, a missing man could vanish into enormous stretches of unexplored country. By the 1860s, more people were traveling through the same regions. There were more roads, more forts, more settlements, more chances that someone might discover evidence. Yet the mountains were still vast enough to hide a person. Imagine a man leaving a settlement in the year 1866. He tells his friends that he intends to travel into the mountains for several weeks. He knows the country well. He has been there before. He expects to return before winter. But weeks pass, then months. His horse never comes back. His family begins asking questions. A local sheriff makes inquiries. Friends search the known trails. Nothing is found. The man's name is written into a local record. Then, the years pass. Eventually, people stop asking. His disappearance becomes part of local memory. Perhaps a story is told about him every few years. A child hears it from a grandparent, then tells it to someone else. The details change, but one fact remains. He went into the mountains and never returned. This pattern repeated across the West. Not every story became famous. Most disappeared with the people who remembered them. But some survived. They became legends. The image of the mountain man grew larger than the real person. He became a symbol of independence. A man who lived by his own rules. A man who feared neither civilization nor wilderness. But the reality was more complicated. Mountain men depended upon other people. They traded with merchants. They relied upon indigenous knowledge. They depended upon companions. They needed communities during difficult winters. Even the most solitary trapper was never completely independent. This is especially important when considering the men who vanished. Some disappeared because of accidents, some because of disease, some because of violence. Some may have chosen to remain in native communities, and some may simply have moved so far beyond the records that historians cannot follow them. The historical record has limits. It cannot tell us everything. That uncertainty has created countless stories. One of the most persistent frontier legends involved the mysterious solitary mountain man. A traveler would supposedly encounter an old bearded man living deep in the wilderness. He spoke little. He knew every mountain trail. He refused to explain where he came from. Then, one day, he disappeared. Perhaps the story was based on a real person. Perhaps it was entirely fictional. The frontier rarely offered enough evidence to decide. But there was a real phenomenon behind the legend. Some men did remain in the wilderness for astonishingly long periods. They became guides, hermits, hunters, traders, or simply wanderers. Their lives existed outside ordinary records. Imagine meeting such a man around the year 1870. He is walking along a mountain trail. His clothing is worn. His beard is long. He carries a rifle. He knows the country better than almost anyone alive. You ask where he lives. He simply points toward the mountains. Perhaps that is his answer. Home is not a building. Home is the landscape. The same mountains that frightened inexperienced travelers had become familiar to him. He knew their sounds. He knew their seasons. He knew where storms gathered. He knew which rivers froze first. He knew where animals sheltered during winter. The wilderness had become a language, but even the most experienced men could make mistakes. Age could weaken the body. Eyesight could decline. Hearing could become less reliable. A man who had survived 20 winters might not survive his 21st. And this created another category of disappearance. The old man who went into the forest one morning and never came home. His family might search, neighbors might search. Perhaps they find his hat, perhaps his rifle, perhaps nothing. The mountains do not explain themselves. There is something deeply haunting about that. A man can spend his entire life learning a landscape and still be defeated by it. By the late 19th century, the United States had changed dramatically. Towns were growing. Railroads connected distant regions. Telegraph lines carried messages across the continent. The frontier was becoming increasingly organized. The mountain men had helped make that transformation possible. Their trails became routes. Their observations became maps. Their knowledge became useful to explorers and settlers. Yet the irony remains. The men who knew the wilderness best helped open it to people who would eventually transform it. Their world was disappearing partly because of the paths they had created. And as it disappeared, the stories became more romantic. People remembered the freedom, the horses, the campfires, the mountains. They remembered the courage, but they often forgot the hunger, the freezing nights, the loneliness, the injuries, the men who never came home. The real mountain man life was not a constant adventure. Much of it was hard work, cold mornings, wet clothing, broken equipment, long journeys, and uncertainty. The wilderness could be beautiful, but beauty did not make it safe. Perhaps that is why the old stories remain so powerful. They remind us of a time when the world was larger, when a person could travel beyond the edge of the map, when silence could last for days, when the disappearance of one man could leave behind a mystery that lasted for generations. And somewhere in those mountains, the traces of that world still remain. An old trail beneath the trees, a stone chimney beside a stream, a rusted trap buried beneath the soil, a weathered grave with no name. These are small reminders that real people once stood there. They made fires, they hunted, they laughed, they struggled, they dreamed of returning home, and sometimes they never did. But our story is not finished. There is still one question we must ask. What really happened to the men who disappeared? How many were victims of the wilderness? How many died in accidents? How many were killed in conflicts? And how many simply chose another life beyond the reach of civilization? The answer may never be known for every man. But by examining what we do know, we can separate the historical truth from the legends that grew around it. And that is where our journey takes us next, into the final years of the frontier, and toward the men whose names survived long after their footsteps disappeared. The old frontier was disappearing, but before it disappeared completely, it left behind one final collection of mysteries. By the late 19th century, the mountain men were no longer the dominant figures they had once been. The fur trade had faded. The great rendezvous belonged to another generation. Railroads had crossed the continent. Mining towns had appeared in the mountains. Settlers had built farms and ranches in valleys that once seemed unreachable. And yet, there were still men who preferred the silence of the high country. Men who traveled beyond the established roads. Men who entered remote valleys with horses, rifles, and small packs, and sometimes never came back. By this time, however, something had changed. There were more records, more newspapers, more government reports, more people watching the wilderness. When a man disappeared, there was a greater chance that someone would notice. But even then, the mountains could remain silent. Imagine a newspaper office in the year 1872. A reporter sits at a wooden desk beneath the flickering light of an oil lamp. A short message has arrived from a remote settlement. A hunter has gone missing. He left several days earlier. His horse returned without him. Searchers have found no body. The reporter writes a few paragraphs. The story is printed. Thousands of miles away, people read about the disappearance. For them, it is a mystery. For the man's family, it is a tragedy. And for the mountains, it is simply another life absorbed into the landscape. One reason these stories are difficult to solve is that disappearance does not always mean death. A man could deliberately leave. He might have become tired of settled life. He might have joined another community. He might have gone farther west. He might have changed his name. In the 19th century, a person could disappear from one society and reappear in another without leaving much evidence behind. This was particularly true in the West. People were constantly moving. Miners moved from one gold camp to another. Hunters followed game. Ranchers searched for land. Travelers joined wagon trains. Former soldiers moved toward new opportunities. A man could leave one town, and within months, nobody there would know where he had gone. Imagine a former mountain man in the year 1875. He has spent decades traveling through the Rockies. He has watched the old fur trade disappear. He has seen wagon roads become railroads. He has watched settlements grow around places where he once camped alone. Perhaps he no longer recognizes the West, so he chooses to leave. He rides toward the mountains. No dramatic farewell, no newspaper story, no mysterious attack. He simply chooses a different life. To the people who knew him, he has vanished, but perhaps he is exactly where he wants to be. This possibility is often overlooked when we hear stories about missing frontier men. Not every disappearance was a tragedy. Some may have been acts of choice, but others were almost certainly fatal. And the most dangerous place remained the high country. Even in the 1870s and 1880s, mountain storms could be deadly. A traveler could leave a settlement under clear skies, only to encounter heavy snow several hours later. A horse could become exhausted. A trail could disappear. Food could run out. A man could become stranded above the tree line. Imagine a traveler crossing a mountain pass during the autumn of 1878. The weather is pleasant when he begins. The sun shines through a pale blue sky. But by afternoon, clouds begin gathering. The wind becomes stronger. Snow begins falling. At first, it is beautiful. Then, the trail disappears. The traveler tries to continue. His horse struggles. Visibility drops. He cannot see the mountains around him. He realizes he has made a mistake. He should have turned back, but now, which direction is back? This is how wilderness disasters begin. Not with one enormous mistake, but with a series of small ones. A person continues a little farther, then another mile, then another, until returning becomes more dangerous than continuing. Night arrives, the temperature falls, the traveler searches for shelter. Perhaps he finds a rocky overhang, perhaps a stand of trees, perhaps nothing. He lights a fire and waits. The next morning, if he survives, he must decide again, move or remain where he is. Experienced mountain men often understood the importance of staying put when lost. Searchers are more likely to find someone who remains in one place, but a frightened person may continue moving, and every mile can make the search harder. This simple truth explains many wilderness disappearances. The missing person may have been alive when the search began, but miles away from where rescuers expected to find him. By the time anyone reached the area, the evidence could be gone. Snow could cover footprints. Animals could scatter belongings. Rain could wash away tracks. Years later, even experienced investigators might have no way of knowing what happened. Another danger was falling. Mountain trails were often narrow. A person could lose his footing on wet rock. A horse could stumble. A pack could shift. A man carrying heavy equipment could fall into a ravine. If nobody witnessed the accident, there might be no recovery. Imagine a narrow mountain trail around the year 1880. A man rides slowly beside a steep slope. The trail is only a few feet wide. Below, a river moves through the valley. His horse suddenly becomes frightened. The animal shifts sideways. The rider reaches for the reins. For a moment, everything is under control. Then the horse slips. The sound of stones falling echoes down the slope. The rider disappears from view. His companions stop. They rush back. But the terrain is steep. The river below is fast. Finding him may take hours. Perhaps they succeed. Perhaps they do not. And if the body is never recovered, another mystery is born. The mountains were also dangerous because of distance. Even in the age of telegraphs and railroads, remote valleys could be incredibly difficult to reach. A message might travel quickly between cities, but a search party still had to travel on horseback into the mountains. The technology of communication had advanced faster than the technology of rescue. That distinction mattered. You could tell someone that a man was missing, but getting to him was another matter entirely. This is why the old mountain man skills remain valuable. People who knew the landscape became guides and scouts. They could identify tracks, locate water, read weather, and choose routes. Some of these men helped search for others. They knew what to look for: an overturned rock, a broken branch, a piece of cloth, a horse track leading away from the main trail. Small clues could become important. Imagine a search party moving through a forest in the year 1884. They have been searching for 3 days. Everyone is tired. The missing man's family has been waiting at the settlement. Then one scout stops. He points toward the ground. A boot print, fresh enough to matter. The men follow. The track leads toward a narrow valley. They discover an old campsite. There are ashes in the fire pit. Someone had been here, but when? The search continues. Perhaps they find the missing man alive. Perhaps they find his belongings. Perhaps nothing. The trail ends again. That final possibility is what makes these stories so haunting. Even when clues exist, they do not always lead to answers, and this is where history must be careful. Later generations often transformed genuine disappearances into legends. A missing trapper became a mysterious hermit. A lonely grave became the resting place of a famous outlaw. An abandoned cabin became evidence of a vanished expedition. A few footprints became proof that someone had survived for decades. Stories grow, but the original event may have been much simpler. A man died. Nobody found him. Time passed. People forgot. That does not make the story less tragic. In some ways, it makes it more human, because the men who disappeared were not legends when they were alive. They were fathers, brothers, friends, sons. They had people waiting for them. They had plans. They expected to return. Perhaps they imagined sitting beside a warm fire again. Perhaps they promised someone they would come home. And then the trail ended. By the closing years of the 19th century, the world that had produced the mountain men had almost completely changed. The old wilderness was being mapped. Railroads crossed the mountains. National forests and other forms of public land management would eventually reshape how people traveled through these landscapes. Towns continued growing. The old trappers became historical figures, but the mountains remained, and with them, the unanswered questions. Who disappeared? Where did they go? Which stories are true? Which were exaggerated? And how many forgotten names lie beneath the forests and valleys of the American West? We may never know, but there is something we can say with certainty. The mountain men were real, the dangers were real, the isolation was real, and the wilderness was powerful enough to erase a human life from the historical record. As we approach the final chapters of our journey, we will look at the stories that survived, the men whose names were remembered, the legends that grew around them, and the quiet truth behind the phrase that has echoed across the frontier for generations. He went into the mountains, and he never returned. By the final decades of the 19th century, the mountain men had become almost ghostly figures themselves. The world that had created them was disappearing. The fur trade had faded. The great rendezvous were memories. Railroads crossed the continent. Towns appeared where temporary camps had once stood. And the vast wilderness that had once seemed impossible to cross was being drawn onto maps with increasing precision. Yet the mountains remained, and so did their mysteries. Somewhere beneath the forests and snowfields were the remains of old camps. Somewhere beside forgotten trails were graves without names. And somewhere in the historical record were men whose stories simply stopped. Perhaps one of the strangest things about these disappearances is how ordinary the final moments may have been. There may have been no dramatic battle, no great storm, no desperate final message. A man may simply have walked away from camp one morning. He may have expected to return before sunset. He may have even smiled at his companions as he left. Then, nothing. Imagine a small settlement in the Rocky Mountains around the year 1885. The morning begins normally. A hunter prepares his horse. He checks his rifle. He carries a small pack of food and ammunition. His friends know where he intends to go. He says he will return that evening. Nobody is worried. The horse walks slowly into the forest. The rider disappears between the trees. Hours pass. The sun moves westward. The man's friends begin preparing dinner. They expect to hear hoofbeats, but the evening grows darker. Still, nothing. At first they wait, then they call his name. No answer. The next morning they organize a search. They follow the trail as far as they can. A hoof print appears beside a stream. Then another. Then the ground becomes rocky. The tracks disappear. The searchers spread out. They examine ravines. They check riverbanks. They climb nearby slopes, but there is no man, no horse, no rifle, no body. After several days they must return. The missing hunter becomes another name attached to the mountains. This is how many mysteries begin, not with a strange discovery, Kai, but with an ordinary person who fails to come home. And once the facts disappear, stories begin to fill the empty space. Perhaps he was killed by an animal. Perhaps he became lost. Perhaps he fell into a canyon. Perhaps he met another group of travelers. Perhaps he decided to remain in the wilderness. Every possibility sounds plausible, and none can be proven. This uncertainty gave rise to some of the most persistent legends of the American West. One story might describe a man who disappeared for years, then suddenly appeared in another settlement. Another might tell of a solitary trapper living in a hidden valley. Someone else might claim that an old cabin belonged to a famous mountain man who had vanished decades earlier. These stories were often passed from one person to another. A traveler would hear the tale at a campfire. He would repeat it at a trading post. Someone else would tell it to a newspaper reporter. By the time the story reached print, it might have changed completely. This is how legends are born, but legends should not cause us to forget the ordinary reality behind them. The American West was dangerous. Men really did die alone. People really did disappear, and the vastness of the country made recovery difficult. Imagine the landscape around the year 1890. A railroad crosses one part of the mountains, but just a few miles away, steep valleys remain almost completely wild. The train passes quickly. Passengers look through windows at distant peaks. They see a beautiful landscape. They may not realize that beyond those visible slopes are ravines that could take days to reach. A person could disappear only a short distance from civilization and still remain almost impossible to find. This was one of the great contradictions of the late frontier. Technology had transformed transportation, but the wilderness had not become smaller. A telegraph message could travel across the country in minutes. A search party still had to ride into the mountains. A train could carry hundreds of people across the continent. But a missing traveler might remain only a few miles from the tracks, completely unseen. There was another reason some men disappeared from the record. They did not necessarily die, they simply moved on. The 19th century was a time of constant movement. A man could leave one territory and travel hundreds of miles to another. He could change occupations, change communities, change his name. He might become a rancher, a miner, a guide, a hunter, a trader, or a member of an indigenous community. For historians, this creates a difficult problem. When a record says that someone was never heard from again, it does not tell us why. It tells us only that communication stopped. The rest is speculation. This is why the phrase, "the men who never returned," should be treated carefully. Some certainly died. Some probably disappeared through accidents or natural causes. Some may have been victims of violence. Others may have chosen to remain beyond the reach of their former lives. The mystery lies partly in the fact that we cannot separate every story. Yet perhaps the most haunting stories are the ones where evidence almost survives. Imagine a remote mountain cabin discovered around the year 1892. Inside are a few objects: an iron cooking pot, a cracked cup, a worn blanket, a rusted rifle. There is a small pile of firewood beside the fireplace. Someone lived here, but when? And where did they go? The cabin might have belonged to a miner, a hunter, a former trapper. Perhaps a family lived there. Without documents, there is no way to know. The objects tell us that people were present. They do not tell us how the story ended. The same is true of old graves. A rough stone marker may indicate that someone was buried there, but the name may be gone. The wooden marker may have rotted away. The person may have been forgotten. Years later, someone walking through the forest may notice the grave and wonder who lies beneath it. That question can remain unanswered forever. And yet, there is something beautiful about the fact that the landscape sometimes preserves what history forgets. A stone chimney, a trail, a grave, a rusted tool. These objects are tiny fragments of memory. They remind us that the wilderness was never truly empty. People lived there, worked there, loved there, died there, and sometimes they vanished there. The old mountain men also left behind something less tangible: knowledge. Their understanding of rivers, weather, animals, and mountain passes helped shape later exploration. Their trails became routes for settlers. Their stories encouraged others to travel west. Their maps made the unknown more familiar. In a strange way, the men who loved the wilderness helped make it less mysterious, but they could not eliminate its dangers. Even after railroads arrived, even after settlements grew, the mountains could still claim people. A prospector might disappear during a snowstorm. A hunter might fall. A traveler might become lost. A miner might never return from a remote valley. The names changed. The circumstances changed, but the pattern remained. Someone went into the mountains. Someone waited for him to return. And eventually, the waiting ended. Perhaps that is why the old mountain man stories continue to fascinate us. They are not really about ghosts. They are about uncertainty. They remind us that there are moments in history where the evidence simply stops. We can follow a person's life for years. We can know where he was born, where he worked, who his friends were, where he traveled, and then one final entry, One final sighting, one final trail. After that, silence. For the mountain men, that silence could stretch across generations. The mountains did not preserve their names. They preserved only fragments. And perhaps that is enough, because every fragment suggests a larger story. A man beside a fire, a horse tied beneath a tree, a rifle resting against a cabin wall, a trail leading toward the mountains, the sun disappearing behind a ridge, and a promise. I'll be back before dark. But darkness came, and the man never returned. By the final years of the 19th century, the mountain men had almost disappeared from the world they once knew. The great fur companies were gone. The rendezvous camps had faded into memory. The trails that once belonged to a handful of experienced trappers were now crossed by settlers, miners, ranchers, soldiers, and tourists. Railroads had pushed deep into the west. Telegraph wires connected distant towns. Maps had become more accurate. The unknown was becoming known. And yet, the mountains still held their secrets. Perhaps that is the most remarkable part of this story. Civilization could map the peaks. It could name the rivers. It could build roads across the valleys. But it could not erase the silence of the wilderness. Men still disappeared. Some were miners, some were hunters, some were prospectors, some were simply travelers looking for a new beginning. The mountain man had become a symbol of an earlier age, but the danger that had claimed him had never truly disappeared. Imagine a remote settlement in the year 1893. The town is small. A few wooden buildings stand beside a dusty road. There is a general store, a stable, perhaps a saloon. Beyond the last buildings, the mountains rise. A man prepares to leave town. He tells his friends he is heading into the high country. He expects to return within several days. Nobody thinks much of it. People disappear temporarily all the time. A prospector may spend longer than expected searching for gold. A hunter may follow game into another valley. A traveler may decide to take a different route. But days pass, then a week. The man does not return. Someone begins asking questions. Where was he last seen? Which trail did he take? Did anyone travel with him? What supplies did he carry? A small search party forms. They ride toward the mountains. At first, everything seems straightforward. There are tracks. The trail is visible. The weather is clear. Then the searchers reach a fork. One trail climbs toward the ridge. The other follows a river. Which one did the missing man take? Nobody knows. They choose one. They search for hours. Nothing. They return to the fork. Try the other trail. Still nothing. This is the problem with searching the mountains. A person can make a single decision that multiplies the search area enormously. If the missing traveler went left, the searchers must look left. If he went right way, they must look right. If he crossed the river, the possibilities expand again. The mountains become a maze, and the person being searched for may be completely unaware that anyone is looking. Perhaps he is injured. Perhaps he is lost. Perhaps he has already died, or perhaps he is simply somewhere else. This uncertainty explains why some disappearances remained unsolved for decades. But there is another possibility. The man may have intentionally disappeared. This happened more often than we might imagine. The American West attracted people who wanted distance from their former lives. Some were escaping debt. Some wanted to avoid the law. Some were simply tired of civilization. Others had become accustomed to solitude. The mountains offered anonymity. A person could leave a town, ride into the wilderness, and become almost impossible to locate. Imagine a man standing on a mountain ridge around the year 1895. Behind him lies the settlement. Ahead, miles of forest and mountains. He looks back once, then turns his horse toward the wilderness. He may never return, but this time, that does not mean the mountains killed him. Perhaps he wanted to disappear. Perhaps he found exactly what he was looking for. A life without questions, without schedules, without crowds, without anyone asking where he came from. These men complicate the historical record. When a person disappears, we naturally assume something terrible happened. But sometimes, the disappearance itself was the goal. This was especially possible in the American West, where vast areas still offered isolation. Even as settlements expanded, there were remote valleys where a person could remain unseen for years. The old mountain men understood this better than almost anyone. They knew where to go. They knew how to travel without attracting attention. They knew how to survive with little. Some had spent decades learning the landscape. For them, the wilderness was not empty. It was full of hiding places. But there was another group whose stories became intertwined with the old mountain man legends, prospectors. The discovery of gold and other valuable minerals drew thousands into the mountains. They came searching for fortunes. Some found them, most did not. A prospector might spend months digging into a hillside. He could live alone in a crude cabin. He could travel deep into remote country looking for signs of mineral wealth. And if he disappeared, there might be nobody nearby to notice. Imagine a prospector in the year 1897. He has heard rumors of gold in a remote valley. He loads his supplies onto a horse. He follows an old trail into the mountains. Days pass. He finds nothing, but he continues. The valley becomes narrower. The trees become thicker. The trail becomes faint. Eventually, he reaches a place where the old path disappears completely. He could turn back or continue. He continues. Perhaps he finds gold. Perhaps he finds nothing. Perhaps he becomes lost. Years later, someone might discover his abandoned cabin. Inside, an old pickaxe, a rusted cooking pot, a few bottles, maybe a bed frame. But no man. The question immediately appears, what happened to him? The answer may be perfectly ordinary. He could have moved on. He could have returned to civilization. He could have died somewhere else. But the empty cabin makes the story feel mysterious. This is how forgotten places become legends. The landscape itself seems to invite speculation. A broken cabin deep in the forest, a grave beside a mountain trail, an abandoned mine, a rusted rifle beneath a tree. Each object feels like part of a story, and often it is. But we have to be careful. Not every mysterious object belonged to a missing mountain man. Not every abandoned cabin hides a tragedy. Not every unmarked grave belongs to a famous figure. History is often less dramatic than legend, yet the real stories are remarkable enough. Men really did enter the mountains alone. Men really did become lost. Men really did die without witnesses. And men really did choose to disappear. The old mountain men understood this uncertainty better than anyone. They knew that a person could leave civilization and become almost invisible. They also knew that the mountains could erase evidence with extraordinary efficiency. A snowfall could cover a trail. A river could carry away belongings. A forest fire could destroy a cabin. A landslide could bury a campsite. Time itself became another force. 10 years could transform a trail. 20 years could erase a cabin. 50 years could make a familiar valley almost unrecognizable. And after a century, a person might leave behind nothing at all. No grave, no belongings, no record, not even a name. That may be the fate of many of the mountain men who never returned. We know that some existed. We know where some traveled. We know that some disappeared. But we cannot reconstruct every ending. And perhaps we should accept that. There is a temptation to solve every mystery, to find a final explanation, to decide exactly how every man died. But history does not always provide that luxury. Sometimes, the most honest answer is simply, we don't know. And there is something strangely peaceful about admitting that. The mountains existed before these men. They remained after them. They watched generations of travelers cross their valleys. They witnessed the rise and fall of the fur trade. They saw wagon trains, gold seekers, railroads, towns, wars, and modern highways. The old mountain men became part of that enormous history. Some were remembered, many were forgotten, and some became legends precisely because nobody knew how their stories ended. As our journey approaches its final chapter, we are left with one last image, an old trail disappearing into a forest. No footprints, no horse tracks, no sign of human activity. The trees stand silently on both sides. Beyond them, the mountains rise beneath a fading evening sky. Perhaps a man once walked that trail. Perhaps he carried a rifle. Perhaps he was heading toward a distant camp. Perhaps he believed he would return the following morning. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. We will never know. But somewhere beyond that trail, the wilderness still remembers. And now, it is time to look back at everything these men left behind. The mountains are quiet now, at least quieter than they were 2 centuries ago. The great trails of the mountain men have changed. Some have become roads, some have disappeared beneath forests, some are buried beneath modern towns. The rivers still move through the valleys, the peaks still rise into the sky, and the wind still passes through the same forests where trappers once built their fires. But the men themselves are gone. Their era has ended. What remains are fragments, names written in old journals, stories told around campfires, weathered cabins, rusting tools, unmarked graves, and the occasional trail leading into the wilderness before disappearing completely. These fragments may seem small, but together they tell us something extraordinary. The mountain men were not simply adventurers wandering through an empty wilderness. They were participants in one of the most dramatic periods of American history. They lived during a time when the boundaries of the United States were expanding rapidly. They crossed lands already inhabited by indigenous nations. They traded, they married, they fought, they explored, they hunted, and they helped create the networks that eventually brought more settlers into the American West. Their lives were complicated, their world was complicated, and their stories deserve to be remembered as more than romantic legends. Imagine the Rocky Mountains around the year 1805. Very few Americans understand the landscape beyond the Great Plains. Maps are incomplete. The mountains appear almost like a wall separating one world from another. A traveler looking west might wonder what lies beyond those peaks, rivers, forests, deserts, unknown valleys, perhaps even a route to the Pacific. Then, men begin going there. Some are explorers, some are traders, some are hunters, and some become the mountain men. They learn to move through a world that seems impossible to understand. They learn the language of rivers. They learn the habits of animals. They learn the signs of weather. They learn which mountains can be crossed and which should be avoided. They learn from people who knew the land long before they arrived. And slowly, the unknown becomes familiar, but familiarity never means complete safety. That is perhaps the greatest lesson of their story. A man could know the mountains better than almost anyone and still disappear. A skilled trapper could survive years of hardship and die from a single accident. A famous explorer could cross thousands of miles and still vanish on an ordinary journey. The mountains did not care about reputation. They did not care about experience. They did not care about courage. They simply remained cold, beautiful, immense, unforgiving. This is why the stories of the men who never returned continue to fascinate us. We want to know what happened. We want an ending. We want to find the final footprint and follow it to the place where the story ends. But sometimes there is no final footprint. There is only silence. And perhaps that is the most honest ending history can offer. Some men almost certainly died from accidents. Some were killed by disease. Some may have fallen from cliffs or drowned in rivers. Some were lost during storms. Some were victims of violence, and others may have chosen not to return at all. They found new families, new communities, new lives. The people who knew them before may have believed they were gone forever, but perhaps somewhere beyond the last trail, they were simply living differently. That possibility reminds us that disappearance does not always mean death. Sometimes it means leaving one world behind. The mountain men lived in a period when such a choice was possible. A man could ride beyond the settlements. He could follow a river into the wilderness. He could cross a mountain pass. And eventually, there might be nobody left who knew where he had gone. Today, that kind of disappearance is difficult to imagine. Modern communication has changed everything. We carry devices that can reveal our location. Roads cross the country. Airplanes can reach remote places. Satellites photograph landscapes from above. Emergency services can be contacted within seconds. But the mountain men lived in another world, a world where the nearest help might have been hundreds of miles away, a world where a person could disappear without anyone knowing for days, sometimes weeks, sometimes forever. Imagine one final campfire. The year is 1860. 3 old mountain men sit beneath the stars. They have spent years traveling through the Rockies. Their rifles rest beside them. Their horses are tied nearby. The fire burns quietly. One man tells a story about a friend who disappeared many years earlier. He remembers exactly where they last saw him. He remembers what the man was wearing. He remembers the weather. He remembers the promise. "I'll be back before dark." But he never came back. The other men listen. Nobody interrupts. They have heard stories like this before. Every mountain man probably had one. A friend who died, a companion who disappeared, someone who simply stopped returning. The storyteller looks toward the darkness beyond the fire. For a moment, he says nothing. The mountains rise around them. The stars are bright. The fire cracks softly. And somewhere beyond the trees, the wilderness stretches for miles. Perhaps the missing man lies beneath that earth. Perhaps his bones were carried away by a river. Perhaps his descendants live somewhere far from the place where he disappeared. Perhaps nobody knows. The story ends without an answer, and another story begins. That is the strange beauty of history. Not every mystery can be solved. Not every life leaves behind a complete record. Some people disappear so completely that all we have left is a name. And sometimes, not even a name. But forgetting does not mean that those lives were meaningless. Every man who entered those mountains was part of a larger human story. He had hopes, he had fears, he had people who cared about him, he had places he called home. Perhaps he dreamed about returning to them. Perhaps he never did. The mountains became his final destination, and over time, the landscape became his monument. A river became his grave. A forest became his memorial. A distant mountain pass became the last known place where someone remembered seeing him alive. There are no statues for many of these men, no grand monuments, no famous graves. But there are still trails, still rivers, still mountains. And if you stand quietly enough, you can almost imagine the sounds of another age. A horse moving through grass, a rifle being cleaned beside a fire, a kettle hanging over the flames, boots crossing frozen ground, a man's voice speaking softly in the darkness. Then, silence. The same silence that existed before the mountain men arrived. The same silence that remained after they were gone. And perhaps that is where their story truly belongs. Not in the cities, not in the museums, but out there, among the mountains, where the wind moves through the trees, where snow covers the old trails, where forgotten cabins slowly disappear into the forest, where a stone fire ring may be the only evidence that someone once stopped there, someone who may have stayed for a night, a month, a winter, or a lifetime. And somewhere among those mountains, there may still be stories we have never discovered, names hidden in old records, graves without markers, cabins buried beneath the forest, trails erased by time. The past is still there, quietly waiting. So as we close our journey tonight, remember the men who walked into the mountains. Remember the men who returned with stories. Remember those who built families and new lives. And remember those whose journeys simply ended in silence. They were not all heroes. They were not all adventurers. They were ordinary human beings living extraordinary lives. Their world has vanished, but their stories remain, and perhaps on a quiet night when the wind moves softly through the mountains, you can almost hear the old trail calling. A horse walks slowly through the darkness. A fire burns somewhere beyond the ridge. A lone figure looks toward the distant peaks. Then he turns and disappears into the wilderness. Good night, and thank you for joining me here at Whispered History. If this journey through the lives of the mountain men helped you relax, learn something new, or drift a little closer to sleep, please remember to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Whispered History. There are countless forgotten stories still waiting for us. Until our next journey, may your night be peaceful, may your dreams be gentle, and may the whispers of history carry you quietly into sleep.